let's see. So our lecture is going to be about 45 minutes, and we'll leave some time at the end for questions and answers. If you have questions as we go along, feel free to just type them into the chat box, and at the end I will read them out loud so Rebecca can answer the questions. It's a little bit easier that way, so she's not having to read and answer at the same time. So tonight's program, The History of Maine's Women's Clubs, will focus on how the women of Maine brilliantly, this is Nicole's introduction, by the way, give her credit for all these wonderful words, brilliantly use their social clubs to engage in serious political activism that would have in other situations been impossible. While pretending to simply care for the good of their communities, these women embarked on civic activism that tackled issues from suffrage to mutual aid to temperance. Dr. Rebecca White specializes in women's histories and gender studies as a professor at the University of Maine in Augusta. She received her MA at the University of Pittsburgh in European history, and in 2015 earned her PhD at the University of Maine in Canadian American history. Her research interests include histories of public welfare, rural women, human rights, and public health in the 19th and 20th century, Maritime Canada, and New England. She teaches classes on many different topics in history. One which Nicole said she would be really interested in is rebels, renegades, and revolutionaries, women in U.S. history. So thank you for Dr. Rebecca White for joining us tonight. And I will, let's see, what did I say I was going to do? Make you host. So let's make you host. And that should work, yes.
Yep, says I am now. Okay. All right, great. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be with you this evening. Some of this material I'm going to share with you is sort of a sampler of some research that I have done over the years on women's clubs in Maine, some of which I used in my dissertation and some of which I'm really hoping to expand at some point into a more sort of formal article or other sort of publication. So you'll be hearing this sort of more raw collection of information that I'm still sort of working on to kind of figure out exactly what it all means and what I want to say about it. And yeah, but it's a topic near and dear to my heart for sure. So women's history, and often, especially sort of histories of ordinary women who generally have not had much of their stories retained within historical archives or would be recognized even in more traditional historical sort of modes of research. But they, as we all know, they were doing lots and lots of things, many surprising things, and they were also doing them across the political spectrum as well. So some of the groups that we'll talk about tonight are sort of to the left, in the center, and then at least one that's in the far right wing. So women are diverse, right? And they have diverse interests. So we'll talk about women's clubs kind of across an ideological spectrum. So I guess I preface that to say, not all of these women are women I would like to spend time with, but nonetheless, they are interesting, right, to learn about historically. So I prepared some slides of some historical records and images for us to look at. So let me go ahead and share my screen now. And I've cut this down to fit in the 45 minutes, but I do tend to get excited and go on. So I'm going to keep my eye on the clock as well, because I want to have time for questions and any discussion that folks have. Bear with me for a second while I make this look nice. Hard when you have all the things open on your screen at the same time. Try to make this smaller so you could actually see the things. Okay, so title of my talk tonight, Left, Right, and Center, an overview of Maine women's clubs across the ideological spectrum. So I'd start off, let me see if I can get rid of this little box here at the bottom. Yes, okay, good. So women's clubs across the US and Canada, but our specific focus tonight is Maine. We can, obviously they still exist today in a variety of forms, and they were perhaps even more common turn of the century, sort of beginning in the mid 19th century and then going forward. So when we think about women's clubs, it's this huge category, right, of different organizations. We can think about back then and today, what were they for, right? Why did women join them? What were they hoping to accomplish? What can their records tell us? Were they purely social organizations? Did they have political kind of ambitions? Were they concerned with things like social welfare and charity? Were they championing some forms of education or the arts or the building of playgrounds or libraries? And we see that in women's clubs, often they would unite women across an ideological or political spectrum who might not necessarily have agreed with each other on many things, but could come together on certain issues. So I argue that these clubs are an example of women's political power in the 19th century and well through the 20th century. And much of that power came from these women's kind of building on a concept historians have identified as something called maternalism or civic housekeeping. I don't know if any of you have heard those terms before, but basically what that means is the idea was that women had some sort of innate ability to be good at nurturing children, nurturing families, taking care of things. And the idea here was that women were just naturally good at that. And in an era before women had opportunities to access professional educations and gain expertise in professional jobs, one area in which they could kind of gain a foothold was in areas that were considered to be quote unquote maternal, right? Or part of their sort of quote unquote natural abilities. So this leads to women sort of gaining a toehold in professional circles in areas like education, nursing, but also very much so into sort of progressive social reform. So this political cartoon here provides this sort of hopeful image of, what is the world like before women get the vote? This is obviously pre-suffrage. And I know this is slightly blurry, but it's essentially, it's full of sort of booze and violence and drugs and dirt, decay, is very disorderly, etc. And the idea here was that once women got the vote, they would change everything. They would build playgrounds and they would have, they would remove, literally, like a lot of times the images would use women with brooms. They would engage in civic housekeeping, meaning they would clean up shop, like they would sweep out the corruption. They would sweep out the things that they saw as negative, and they would have libraries and playgrounds and sound government and all these sorts of things. So the idea was that sort of women's innate natural goodness would help improve society. Obviously, this is a very idealistic idea of what will happen, and it's very much characterizing all women as sort of being a monolith, which we know is not true. Nevertheless, this was this sort of notion of maternalism is critical, I think, in understanding the ways in which women were able to enact real, have real political power even before they gained the right to vote. So this evening, I'm going to give you just some examples of a little sort of sampler of a few different women's organizations across sort of a spectrum. So we're going to look a little bit at Maine suffragists, the Maine suffrage movement. We'll look at an example of a women's club on Indian Island near Orono. So it's known as the Wabanaki Women's Club. The Mrs. Maine Club, which was a club that was established after World War II for the wives of students who were veterans. as well as at clubs that, are on the far right of the spectrum, like the women's branches of the Ku Klux Klan, which certainly existed in Maine in the 1920s. So I argue that these clubs provide insight into ordinary women's activisms in ways that often don't show up in textbooks, and is often sort of fragmentary. These are not famous women, and therefore their history is too often lost. So I'm just going to talk about, just give an overview of a few of these organizations. They will not come close to giving you a sense of the overall breadth. So I've made a list here of all the different ones. There are hundreds and hundreds. If we looked at had a snapshot of what were women doing in 1920 in Maine in terms of women's organizations, there were literally thousands. So we're talking about charitable organizations, literary societies, societies for business and professional women, municipal improvers, parent-teacher associations, and they were doing all kinds of different work. So again, this would just be kind of like a little bit of an overview of some that I thought might be most interesting to your group. Okay. So in Maine, just like in other parts of the country, in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, women dominated charitable action in the U.S. This is before the government, the federal government or the state government really had much in the way of social welfare programming, and much of the work that was done was really dominated by women. Through private charities and also through religious charities. And we know that aid societies flourished through this time. So move ahead and I'll come back to this one. My slide a little bit out of order. So first I want to talk about women who were sort of organizing towards progressive social justice sort of actions, as well as toward suffrage. So certainly I would be remiss if I didn't note that all of this has an even deeper history in terms of the long association and long work of Maine women toward the temperance movement, which was sort of like the grandmother organization for so many of these women. That really was a place in which a lot of women gained political expertise and organizing expertise, and also had success. So talk about that for a second. So scholars have long documented the strong temperance movement in Maine, and the way what was known as the Maine law to ban alcohol or liquor served as an example of prohibition activism for the entire country. So certainly the Women's Christian Temperance Union was a driving force in that activism, and that organization, as well as other temperance groups, were very popular in Maine. It's clear that a significant proportion of middle-class Maine women were very skilled in social organization, fundraising, and political lobbying toward this goal of temperance. And that expertise really provided the building blocks for later women's groups that focused on social reform in the progressive era and later, including suffrage. So moreover, these temperance supporters included a long line of Republican legislators and governors in Maine who also supported a range of progressive social causes. Vigorous year-round fundraising and civic activism is very evident when you look through these club records, these women's club records. So they are really providing sort of the war chest for a lot of these activities. These included successful campaigns to build and staff playgrounds in Maine, to improve school buildings, to provide hot lunch programs, and offer what were called free milk stations to children, and to otherwise engage in their communities. Club women also were organized not just in cities, but across Maine. So there are many examples of these sorts of clubs in rural areas of Maine as well. So while unpaid, These women's groups, or the women who engaged in this work, themselves created and staffed programs and considered themselves to be well qualified, efficient, and prided themselves on being very businesslike in their endeavors. So just as with the newly emerging class of professional social workers in the same kind of time periods, who are sort of turn of the century, right, around 1900 or so, these women often tried to distinguish themselves as professionals by their education and their credentials. And reading the minutes and the annual reports of these clubs testify to a considerable devotion to order and business sense. So, for example, the Portland Associated Charities, which was established in 1879 to gather information about the city's charitable needs, prided itself on its scientific distribution of aid. So this organization had both male and female visitors that were sent out to survey the city needs and to advocate for a variety of useful services for Portland residents, such as a public laundry, a day nursery, recreation for children, and continuing education classes for both sexes, right? These are ideas that are still good ideas today. So they're way ahead of their time. In terms of creating state law and sort of statewide institutional change to help with issues of poverty, Maine women also were essential. So there was a movement starting in around 1910 to establish state-supported welfare programs for mothers and for widows in Maine. This was something happening around the country. Maine was sort of near the front in terms of the first to organize. These bills basically would provide, they were called mother's pensions or mother's aid or widow's pensions. So they would provide a set monthly allowance to women who qualified, and that's a whole discussion in and of itself, who qualifies for this aid and why. So for example, in Maine, you could qualify if you were a mother, full stop, at least on paper. In other states, they were very explicit about saying, you had to be married. You could not be an unmarried mother, for example. In Maine, at least technically, it was open to anyone. But you had to meet certain sort of guidelines. So anyway, getting these established in Maine, which did happen, they established in 1917, was the culmination of years and years of work by Maine women through their women's clubs, a variety of kinds. So the mother's allowance legislation was spearheaded in public by the Maine Congress of Mother, Parents, and Teacher Associations of Maine. So they were called Mothers Congresses, and then later on they changed the name that still exists, Parent Teacher, the PTA, basically. It's the PTA that championed this effort. In 1911, the national PTA voted to support mother's allowance legislation in every state, and was really successful in sponsoring successful programs like all around the country. And in Maine, the PTA did not exist until 1916. So the PTA in Maine was literally founded by a group of women expressly to pursue the issue of pushing for mother's aid legislation. We know this because they came together very quickly. They got this legislation passed. Again, this is well before suffrage, right? So none of these women can actually vote, but they have strong sort of political leverage and skills with petitioning the government and their legislators. And then they pretty quickly disperse after they have accomplished their goals. This person pictured here, Florence Brooks Whitehouse. She was chair of the National Women's Party in Maine. And so she was a suffrage activist, and she also supported this Mother's Aid campaign. The chief person in charge, I don't have an image for. This is a thing when you want to research sort of quote unquote ordinary women. I can only show you an image of sort of the most famous of them because she was a very wealthy woman, Miss Florence Brooks Whitehouse. But the leader was a lady who lived in Augusta. And it took me quite a while even to find her first name. She is everywhere listed as Mrs. Delbert Adams, but her name was Alice Adams. She was the wife of the owner of several very successful department stores in Augusta, Maine, and she had 3 children. And while those children were very young, in 1916, she got elected to the first meeting of the State Association of the Maine PTA. That put her in charge of 28 local PTAs, which had approximately 1,200 members. She then, in October of 1916, went on to hold a statewide conference in Portland. They met alongside their allies, the Maine Teachers Association, which while not a women's organization, had many, many women members. So they had about 4,000 members at their organization, and they discussed working together for this mother's allowance or mother's pension legislation. They held open meetings in Portland, and they worked to gain the support of 16 different Maine women's clubs, including the WCTU, the Maine Federation of Women's Clubs, the YWCA, the Daughters of the American Revolution, the District Nurses Associations. And this is, I think, a really interesting detail to go back to this image here. They managed to get on board both the suffrage organizations in Maine, which were led by women, and the anti-suffrage organizations in Maine, which were also led by women. So this is an image here of a pamphlet created by Mrs. Clarence Hale of Maine, giving her arguments why women should not have the right to vote. So again, more evidence that we have women across a wide political spectrum. So this was part of the Maine Association opposed to suffrage for women. You can see this particular one is from 1914. So it was a long, ongoing kind of issue. Nonetheless, it appears that Alice Adams was able to bring together these really divergent kind of groups, and was supported by the governor. So in January of 1917, a board to create the board of the Maine Congress of Mothers and the Parent Teacher Associations officially endorsed Maine's new law, which was an act to provide for mothers with dependent children. And it was later voted into law. To quote a Reverend Henry Dunnick, who was an advocate for this, who had addressed this work, Dunnick termed this aid not a pension, but an efficient, what he called, reward for services to the nation for women who were preserving families and strengthening national unity. One of the main purposes of these mothers' allowances was to prevent the breakup of the family, primarily due to poverty, and also to prevent or try to work against the truly outrageously high levels of infant mortality that were very common in this time by keeping families together. Okay, so in 1917, the Maine Congress approved this legislation, and Congress authorized $35,000 to fund the first 2 years of the program. My whole dissertation is about mother's pension, so I could go on and on and on about that, but I wanted to give you an overview. So to go back to suffrage, and again to Mrs. Florence Brooks Whitehouse. She was the founder and chair of the Maine branch of the National Women's Party, and she was a frequent public speaker in Maine and elsewhere on suffrage. And because of that, she endured sort of scathing kind of public commentary about all aspects of her personality, her looks, etc. This was one of the more flattering images I found, which I found at the Maine Historical Society in Portland. It was part of a collection called Mother Goose Comes to Portland. And she is sort of portrayed as a woman who is trying to gain political support from political candidates by offering them pies and trying to get them on her side. So that's sort of, she was a wealthy woman, a white person, but women's clubs in Maine were not only filled with sort of middle-class women. Women of all different backgrounds also, I think I would argue, tried to use maternalism as a way of gaining some political power for themselves and improving things in their community. And many of the women who did that did so against pretty high odds. They didn't have the time that middle-class women had because they're working, or because they faced, racial barriers and stereotypes of the time. So this group, the next group I want to mention here is the Wabanaki Women's Club, which functioned from 1897 until 1952. I came across just a few mentions of this organization because they affiliated with the with the Maine Federation of Women's Clubs, and then also with the national organization. So their name came up, and when I was looking for something completely different, and it really struck me that, oh, we're Native American women. I wasn't surprised that they would be forming organizations, but I was surprised that they would be included as part of these official sort of state level organizations at this time, but they were. So in 1897, this was the first mention I could find of this. There were a few different newspaper accounts that came up I would say the newspaper accounts were not overly flattering. So they sort of reported about this new women's club in tones that were sort of a mixture of surprise and mockery. That it had happened that a women's club had been created on Penobscot tribal reservation land on Indian Island, Maine. So I found reference to this in one of them, I think, was in Iowa, other places. So it sort of got picked up by various newspapers as sort of this social interest sort of thing. So this was a cultural and social club. It was started by a lady named Mrs. Martha Nicolar. So she was the wife of a prominent Penobscot leader, Horace Nicolar. And she organized it in 1897, and they were quickly accepted into the Maine Federation of Women's Clubs, meaning they were dues-paying members. They could be invited to the state meetings. They attended banquets. That may not seem like a big deal, but in 1897, it certainly was. So I was surprised to find that level, at least of minimal integration at this time. So while they were treated as merely a curiosity in newspaper accounts, we do know that Mrs. Nicolar, pictured there on the left, attended at least one statewide conference with the purpose of advertising for the building of an industrial school on Indian Island, and apparently was pretty warmly received. So the club was also mentioned in Child Welfare Magazine, which is the national magazine of the Congress of Parents and Mothers. So it seems clear to me that the purpose of this and the purpose of spending money in order to affiliate their organization with this bigger state network was to try to gain some political capital to make improvements on the island. When they organized in 1897, they listed 13 members, and their mission statement was to, quote, collect and preserve all traditions and legends of its tribe. When Mrs. Nicolar attended the statewide meeting, the press noted, or excuse me, this is from the minutes of their own records, of the Maine Federation of Women Club records. They noted that Mrs. Nicolar addressed the Federation briefly, both in English and in her own language, and spoke about their happiness at joining this group and how she hoped that they would be able to work together. The group sort of fell by the wayside a little bit, as far as I can tell, after that, or at least there's very few records remaining. But we do know that in 1931, the club was resuscitated by a relation of the original founder, Florence Nicolar Shea. So in its new organization, it was more overtly political. So Shea herself was the first Penobscot woman to graduate from Old Town High School. She was also a nationally renowned mezzo-soprano who toured under the name Princess Wahatawoso, or Bright Star. So she, when she returned to the island, she married a man named Bruce Pulau, and they performed all across the United States. However, in 1929, when the stock market crashed, the Nicolars returned to the Penobscot Reservation with the idea of trying to work to improve conditions on the island. So she organized all kinds of activities through the club. They sold Penobscot artwork. They advocated for increased access to Penobscot children to attend the mainland school, and for all kinds of other services. I also found reference in 1941 that their next leader, Mrs. Sadie Mitchell, was a graduate in 1941, in June of 1941, from the University of Maine. So that made her only the second Native American woman to graduate from the University of Maine. She also rejoined their club to the General Federation and sent a contribution to the foundation's 5-year fund. She successfully used the club to promote Penobscot voting rights and for the construction of a permanent bridge between Indian Island and Old Town in Maine. So I think that a lot more research would need to be done. I had a very hard time finding any sources for this, but given more time, I would like to delve more into this remarkable women's club and sort of examine the ways, it seems to me, they are making strategic use of maternalism and of the concept of womanly respectability and the club work of joining the Maine Women's Federation to try to gain allies for their cause. And I think that by strategically aligning themselves with Anglo-American women's clubs, this represents sort of a harnessing of highly gendered, sort of middle-class women's club practices in a ways that could be used to achieve way more radical goals, such as voting rights and educational rights for the Penobscot Nation as a whole. Okay. So, okay, so complete U-turn now. Talk about an entirely different group just for a few minutes. And this work here is drawn mainly from secondary research that I did. So I found a small write-up by Professor Maureen Elgersman when she was a professor at USM a few years ago. She wrote like a little two-page article about the women's auxiliary of the Women's Ku Klux Klan, the auxiliary of the Ku Klux Klan, and how it operated in Maine. And her way of getting into that initial conversation was that she became aware that the Maine, that a set of seals like you would emboss into paper, had been donated to a historical society, and she sort of was examining these and trying to figure out what they were. And what they were the seals for a women's branch of the Ku Klux Klan. You can see this is number 21. This particular one is for Holton, but they also had seals in the collection for Augusta and for Bath. This group, initially when they chartered as a national organization, they claimed to have 125,000 members at a national level. By the mid 1920s, the WKKK national membership was probably about 500,000, and they had established chapters in at least 36 states, and Maine was one of them. So these women represent a really fascinating and, of course, disturbing study of women's organization and power and club work in the 1920s. So although much of the historical research that's been done about the WKKK deals with places where they were the biggest, so that would be in Indiana and Ohio, we do have a few materials to indicate their presence in Maine, such as these embossed seals. So the seal for Augusta was clan number 11. The seal for Bath was clan number 15. This one is clan number 21. So this seems to indicate that there were more of these. So the Augusta, the Bath, and the Holton seals all have the same formula, but they are differentiated with the name. So this indicates that, you know, this was done with very much care and intention. In addition to bearing in the outer circle the women of the Ku Klux Klan, and then the place, right, the locale of that organization, the inner circle bears the image of a woman holding a sword and a shield on some. On this one, it's much more simplified, right? And then we also find the cross and then the letters of the representing WKKK that you can see around that. So I want to stress that I don't think Maine was an exception. In other words, that it wasn't that there was particularly more women's Ku Klux Klan organizations in Maine than elsewhere, but simply to point out that they did exist here. And that would be sort of in line with other trends that were happening in this period. It seems that these are dated between 1923 and 1928. There's not a great deal of documentation, but we do have the records for at least one of the organizations, and we know that they charged a $10 fee per year for membership. The Augusta Klan, Women's Klan organization, of course, it's significant that they're based in our state's capital. And soon after their founding in 1920, they became even more politically active because now they had voting rights as well. So they strongly advocated for votes along the line of what they called 100% Americanism. Which basically meant that they were opposed to anyone gaining political power or political office that was not born in the US or was not a Protestant. So much of the focus in Maine was on sort of anti-Catholic activism, we can put it that way. Anti-Catholic as well as anti-immigrant activism. Okay. So to switch gears again, sort of a wild swing in a different direction, I'm going to talk about this final women's club or women's organization that I'd like to mention. And this was one that I got particularly interested in a few years ago because I'd never heard of it before. And it was when I was still studying on the campus at Orono, and I became fascinated to research more about women's clubs at the university level. What were women doing? And I found this group that really intrigued me called the Mrs. Maine Club, the Mrs. Maine Club. So as part of other research I was doing, I was reading through all these old records for the Office of the President at the University of Maine in Orono. And I came across an intriguing old paper file, and the label of that was Veterans / Child Welfare Clinic. So of course I was intrigued and wanted to know what was going on with children at the University of Maine in the 1940s. And through that lucky find, I uncovered information about this really remarkable community of women that flourished on campus from the late 1940s well into the 1970s. They were known initially as the GI Wives Club. Later, they changed their name to the Mrs. Maine Club. And what's interesting is they start out as not students themselves, but as the wives of students. So it's a small group of student wives. They banded together and through their efforts managed to establish a cooperative daycare center on campus, as well as a children's health center or health clinic, both of which were successful, long-lasting, and almost completely self-supporting. They were almost entirely independent. So I used records from the university archives, from college yearbooks, and from newspaper articles I could find as evidence that I could see pretty clear evidence they used their status. So coming back again to maternalism, they used their status as wives and mothers, and particularly because they were, many of them, wives and mothers of veterans from World War II. They used that as sort of leverage to gain university support for their agenda. So what started in the 40s as an organization for student wives, by the 50s had turned into a popular campus club. So they, I'll show you some images here. This is of these barracks that were moved to Orono in 1946 to serve as emergency housing for the families of veterans who were coming to live on campus and take advantage of the GI Bill. So by the 50s, this was a campus club. It was open to all married women students or wives of students. They were regularly featured in the yearbooks as a campus club. And I think also looking at the Mrs. Maine Club provides interesting insights into the connections that at least I hadn't thought of between these women on campus, the history of the university's cooperative extension program, which was also dominated by women, and the home economics departments at the University of Maine. So you'll remember, right, your sort of basic history about World War II. One of the big outcomes sort of federally after the war was the GI Bill. So the story begins with the evidence with the GI Bill and the sharp and sort of rapid increase of veterans flooding into colleges and universities all across the country. So at the University of Maine, the numbers in 1946 were almost double what they had been pre-war. So this is a massive expansion. So 3,200 students came to campus. Of those, 1,971 were veterans. So it's just a massive demographic shift. Of those, and these are all those just coming to Maine, to Orono, of those, 554 were already married, many of them with one or more children. So to enable these GIs to be able to attend classes, there was a pressing need for family housing. So the university contracted with the US, with the federal government, and they basically took apart 23 temporary housing barracks that had been used at the South Portland Naval Yards and brought them to campus and installed them to be very basic rudimentary housing. You can see some of the interiors of the cabins here. So beginning in 1946, about 196 veterans families came to the University of Maine and moved in to these 3 or 4 bedroom little tiny apartments. And another 100 families were moved into what can only be described as a motley collection of trailers and cabins and all kinds of different sort of barrack situations for families to live in. These buildings were meant to be only temporary. They were widely regarded as subpar in the extreme, especially in Maine winters. They had several nicknames that I found in the records, one being Splinterville, another being Fertile Valley, as reference to all the children who were born here. So these rough barracks were officially named the South Apartments, and they were immediately filled to capacity with young families. An additional 600 married GI students remained on a waiting list that would have loved to move into this accommodation. Though of poor construction, heated only by oil stoves that were very temperamental, apparently, and often surrounded completely by mud, they were partially furnished, but they were available at very low rents. So that was the major incentive for veterans' families who had very few options to move into with their families. So what does this have to do with women's clubs, right? The women's, the wives really sort of got together to try to address and ameliorate some of the conditions they were living under by working together. So I found a few different descriptions of what it was like to live in these the South Apartments. So, or to live in what was called Pregnant Valley. So, for example, I found one in which they discussed the need to provide a pregnancy certificate so that they could gain this university housing. Another, Frances Harton, who was a high school teacher and later a university librarian, she moved into South Apartments in 1946 with her art professor husband and their 2 young children. And in her memoir, she talked about the thin walls, the lack of insulation, the unreliable coal stove. She said, quote, "It was so cold that the boys played in their snowsuits, even indoors." That the constant cold was also mentioned in a memoir of Dr. A. Dewey Richards, who was a resident with his wife and young children in the 50s. He talked about how the coal fire often went out. It was very hard to relight, and that his wife was forced to go out and cut down tree limbs from university forest with a handsaw, which he then dipped in kerosene in order to relight the stove. So even though the GI Bill provided tuition, books, and supplies for returning veterans, they only provided about $90 a month for the subsistence of everything else. So regardless of how many children you had. Due to this constraint, many of the wives found full or part-time clerical work on campus and grew a tight community to try to make ends meet. They established what they called the Gay 90s, to stand for their $90 a month, the Gay 90s Social Club, to work together on their budgeting and childcare needs. And apparently the concept of children on campus came to be seen as somewhat normal. According to a 1946 Maine alumnus article entitled "Meet the Veteran at Home." So we have sort of a charming image here of the veteran with his books in hand, wife and child on campus. This is an aerial view of campus in which you can see the South Apartments there. And in the Maine alumnus, here's an article, "Meet the Veteran at Home." So it presents a very sort of jolly image of this sort of parade of wives and baby carriages moving across campus to meet dad at the end of a hard day in the classroom, and talks about how these apartments were so tidy and the families are so happy, and the cheerful acceptance of difficulties, that was the quote, by these young families, right? So this sort of very idealized kind of, this is a little blow up of one of the images in the corner here of the wife waiting very patiently for her husband, Scholar, to come home. So regardless of all this cheerfulness, they also needed to actively band together to try to improve things. So in late 1946, a group of 11 wives initiated a survey of all the families in the area and discovered that more than 150 children were on campus with almost no services provided to them. This led to their petition for a meeting in December 1946 with local representatives from the Veterans Administration, the Health Department, the district health nurses, various faculty, and the Dean of Men. And though all present and concerned, quote, expressed much interest, none of them were able or willing to step forward to establish any sort of services for the children, including a health service. So in response, the GI wives organized themselves into a child health council to do it themselves. By February of 1947, they'd organized the first of many child health clinics with a doctor and a public health nurse and 7 veterans' wives assisting. They also were able to gain the assistance of a representative from the Maine Cooperative Extension to help them organize other efforts on campus. They did fundraising. They had a benefit dance that was very cutely called the Baby's Ball. And they raised money to help establish this thing in conjunction with the Cooperative Extension. They worked to have a playground built. This is a reenactment of this meeting here in which President Hawk agrees to go forward with some of this work. An image of the 1948 Child Health Clinic that was published in Maine Alumnus Magazine of the work they were doing. And then their next big achievement was in 1949, they were able to establish the Maine Cub Nursery School and started this daycare essentially with 21 pupils on campus. The nursery school was established in South Estabrook Hall on campus and was directed by a 5-member group of women from the Mrs. Maine Club. They were open every weekday morning, and they were open to all children of students. And so in addition, the school was able to employ a teacher, an assistant, and a visiting nurse. And again, this was all mainly based on their own fundraising efforts. The university provided a place for them to do it, but they supplied everything else. Beyond that, they were able to fully operate this school on their own. Their records show it cost about $140 a month to operate, and they covered that through $5 small donations and through their own volunteer work. We know that the Maine Cub Nursery School, so here we are getting ready to build a playground. This is a list I found I thought was very charming. 1949 invoice for toys and books for the Maine Cub Nursery School that you can see they purchased, looks like about $29 worth of materials. More images of life in South Apartments, including a charming little rhyme here. This is from the yearbook. Last but not least, for the many married students who attend the university, I wonder if Daddy really does do the cooking. A baby in the house can make parents so proud and happy. I hope daughter realizes that Pop will be driving her through the books in a few years. So here's an image from the Child Care Center. An image of the 1959 Maine Cub graduates from the school they established. The school remained in operation until 1964, when it was closed because of declining enrollments. And they also established well baby clinics that remained vital at least, this was, I believe, the last image I could find, at least through 1969. There's photographic evidence from the newspaper of this work, vital work carrying on. So I could say a lot more about this, but I think I'll start to sort of wrap up here. I do think that this, like the Mrs. Maine Club, for example, is an example of really impressive maternalist social activism carried on by ordinary women to achieve their goals. They were able to build on the social capital of being veterans' wives and to use it to create real world results in the form of the nursery school and the child health clinics. I think overall, their story, much like the story of these other women's groups that I've sort of very briefly alluded to in this lecture, provide rich repositories of knowledge about the aims, aspirations, and political will of thousands of ordinary Maine women many of whom likely did not consider themselves to be particularly political, but who nonetheless were engaged in political work to improve their communities as they saw it, or to organize themselves for their own aims. So I'll go ahead and conclude there.